have a little agenda for what I'd like to kind of cover today, given the fact that Navisworks is such a large product. There's such a number of different modules and different ways that you can interface with the product. So on the agenda here, you can see the top 10 things I'd like to go ahead and cover, right? I'm going to go and talk a little bit about what the product is, show you the interface, talk a little bit about how Navisworks projects are put together, dive into how to manipulate views and redline a Navisworks model. And then on the right column, you can see we're going to dive in deeper into some of the main features of Navisworks, right? Everything from its appearance profiler, which allows you to control the visibility of objects in a way that makes it easy for you to understand what information is in your Navisworks project file. The Clash Detective, probably the single most important aspect of Navisworks and the reason why most AEC professionals use the tool, which is a way to run clashes and understand where you may have issues between conflicting elements within a model. Timeliner, which enables us to essentially create a construction-based, a construction timeline via a schedule and the elements in the model. And then last two, quantification. Autodesk used to, at one point, had a product called Autodesk QTO. Around 2013, it was merged into Navisworks, and basically it allows you to do quantification of your model information. And then last but not least, two tools that I'll touch upon briefly, as they're on the peripheral edge of what most use cases are for Navisworks, but it does provide an easy way to create a nice, pretty picture, so to speak, using the animator and presenter tools, whether it's a walkthrough, a still shot, something that you want to use as a beauty shot to present for a client, or to create a still for use in a construction documentation set. Those tools will allow you to get there. So it will be, as far as the presentation goes, it won't be death by PowerPoint. In fact, this will be the last slide that you see here on the introduction, and we'll spend most of the time actually working inside of the product. So as just a quick introduction into what Navisworks is, it was a product that was acquired by Autodesk back in June of 2007. It was a product formerly called as Jetstream, and it was rebranded as Autodesk Navisworks. And at the time, there were three flavors. There was Navisworks Freedom, which was a free viewer, Navisworks Simulate, and Navisworks Manage. The topic that we're going to be talking about today is Navisworks Manage, and the only real difference between the Simulate product and the Manage product was the inclusion of the Clash Detective. This tool was primarily focused on giving design firms and contractors a means to perform coordination, right? So whether you're working in Revit or AutoCAD or CATIA or any of the other various tools that exist for design and development in the AEC industry, we needed a common platform so that we could aggregate all that information and create a federated model. And that's the purpose of Navisworks. So I'm going to jump into Navisworks, and we're going to walk through all the things that I just discussed. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just bring up the Navisworks interface. And we'll spend a little bit of time here just getting yourselves oriented with the way Navisworks looks. Now, if those of you who are familiar with Autodesk products and the ribbon interface, it's pretty much the same sort of thing. Across the top, you have the application menu, quick access toolbar, and all your ribbons that have your various tools and workflow items. So the way that Navisworks is organized, you can see here, I won't read off all the items, but you have home, viewpoint, animation, view, and simply clicking on any one of these will present to you a series of tools used to manipulate your model. You can also see docked all along the left side, the right side, and across the bottom, various tabs, right? These tabs are called palettes, and they represent all the various ways that you can use Navisworks to run either a clash detection or some measurement tools or do quantification. And you'll see that as I hover or I move over and I select one of these, you'll see that the palette appears, and as I move back, it collapses, right? Any of the pinned elements can be set so that if you're working in a particular palette, you can utilize it quite easily. And of course, they can all be dragged and dropped and manipulated across the screen. So as I click and hold one of the palettes, the selection tree, which allows me visibility into the elements within a Navisworks model, you'll see that I get a series of icons that represent how I can dock this palette. Now, the ones on the furthest sections, right, top, right, bottom, left, they allow you to occupy the entire section of the side that it's directing you to. The ones in the center allow you to manipulate them and have them dock next to other elements that may be open. So you can see if I choose to dock it down here, it occupies only the space between plan view and my tilt. If I go ahead and I move it all the way down, it occupies the entire section. So I'm going to go ahead and just dock it back here on the left, and you'll see that I'll stack it above the plan view. Right? So just basic manipulation, drag and drop. One thing that's great to point out is if you go through and you're experimenting with Navisworks and you start opening and closing some of these palettes, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, I've closed things and I don't know how to bring them back. It's very easy to do so. You can go to your View tab. And in your View tab, there's a couple of different ways to approach this. You can go to your Windows dropdown and select which of the palettes you want to see that are available. Or the easier way is to load a workspace directly. And so with loading a workspace, I can choose one of the pre-built ones, or if I want, I can create one of my own workspaces from scratch. I'm going to go ahead and use the extended. The extended provides me most of my tools that I'll be using for this presentation, and it's an easy way for me to reset the screen so that I can start showing you how model aggregation works inside of Navisworks. One important thing to point out is that it really helps to have multiple monitors, right? So you can drag some of these palettes off the screen, giving you more canvas space to look at your model. I don't have that liberty given that I'm doing a presentation on my laptop screen. And while I do have a second monitor, I can't share both effectively. So I'll do my best to manipulate the screen to show you all the pertinent information and hide the things that aren't relevant. So with that introduction, I think the last thing I'll mention is that there are a couple of items on the lower right-hand side that people ask about quite often when I'm doing a training class. These icons here represent the sheet browser if you're working in a project file that has attached sheets via PDF or some other format like DWF. And then these three icons here on the lower right represent ways that, or processes that Navisworks is undergoing as you're manipulating the project. The pencil icon indicates writing to the hard drive, redrawing on the screen. The cylinder shape indicates writing to the hard drive, and because you can open up a Navisworks project from the cloud, this represents your network connectivity. So at any time, if you see those flashing, you'll know that information is being written to and from those sources. Now we get into the topic of file aggregation, which is the first and primary use of Navisworks. And in order to do so, what I'd like to do, and I can do this a number of ways, but I'm just going to go to the application menu and select Open and choose Open. And what I want to point out initially is the variety of different file types that you can really import into Navisworks. Now, there's a lot of information here that I want to cover, so I'll just go through it piecemeal. What I'll point out initially is that Navisworks isn't just Autodesk-based, meaning that it can't just import Autodesk products. It can bring in a variety of various application design files. And so, I'll point out some of the major ones that are non-Autodesk, right? You have MicroStation, you have CATIA, you have Rhino, you have Revit is one of those, but SketchUp, SolidWorks, Leica for point clouds, Inventor files, which are Autodesk, FBX, which is a industry-wide used file format for exchange of 3D information with materials and lighting, and the rest. Right? Won't go into. I won't elaborate on each one. Specifically, though, what I'd like to just indicate is that there are some Navisworks file types that are unique, right? And they refer to them as Navisworks Cache, NWC, Navisworks Document, NWD, and Navisworks File Set. In order for me to really dive into those, I'd like to first create a file from scratch to get you situated with what Navisworks is. So I'm going to cancel out of this just momentarily, point out that I'm working in an empty model. I don't have anything in the model quite yet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up from a series of local files, three NWC files, right? An architectural model, a structural model, and a mechanical model. And when I'm going to go ahead and click open, and you're going to see them appear on the screen in my canvas, you're going to see them appear in my selection tree as NWC files. And effectively, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to save this as an NWF file. Now, what do all these file types mean? Well, I have an NWC. The cache file represents a cached version or an optimized version of the original authored file. So in the case of the examples that I'm going to be doing for the entire webinar, these came from Revit. And because they came from Revit, I can't open up a native Revit file type inside of Navisworks. Navisworks needs to create a optimized version of that file in order for it to display on the screen. So that optimized version is the NWC format. The nice thing about the NWC format is that it's linked to the original authored file. So if I make changes to those files and I update the NWC file, my federated model will also be updated, since at the end of the day, what I'm going to create after appending several NWC files is an NWF file. Now, the NWF file stands for Navisworks file set. And what that allows me to do is to construct an aggregated or federated model from various sources, NWCs, NWDs, and some native authoring products, and use that as my federated model. That way I can simply open up that file every single time and not have to worry about appending several models each time I use the product. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and overwrite the 01 introduction Navisworks file set. And effectively what I'm doing is I'm creating a starting point that I can start utilizing as my Navisworks project file. Now, I did a lot of jumping around in the sense that I haven't even shown you how I got to this point from a Revit project. The reason I want to do that is because I want to take an opportunity now to just talk about Revit projects in particular. Navisworks doesn't really matter what kind of information you bring in. Ideally, you're bringing in three-dimensional data. And in a perfect world, you're using Revit to do so because you're bringing in geometry and metadata. That is information, right? The I in BIM. There are a couple of ways to do that. One option is to open up a Revit project directly. And you'll see if I go back to my open dialog window and I choose Revit, you'll see that I can bring in RVT files, Revit project files, RFAs, Revit family, and RTEs, Revit template files. Right? And if I do so, I don't have a lot of ways to ensure that the information that I'm bringing in is exactly what I want. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, since you're creating a federated model, you're not necessarily wanting to import every single element within a Revit project. You're going to only want to bring in the elements that you're going to utilize later on for either a timeline exercise or for clashing, or for presentation, right? So if you're running a clash test and you want to see how your structural elements are interfering with maybe your mechanical systems, you don't want to bring in furniture, right? That's just going to add overhead to the Navisworks project. And if you choose to just bring in Revit projects in this way, you might be doing that. There's one way to ensure that you don't do that. And there's a file option inside of Navisworks that allows you to specify what you want to bring in when you bring in a Revit project. And you have three options, right? They're a bit limited, but they get you to where you need to be. The first is a Navisworks view, and I'm going to show you what that means inside of Revit itself. A Navisworks view represents a view inside of Revit called Navisworks that you just set your visibility graphics for, turning on and off the things you want. And when you create that Revit project file inside of Navisworks, you'll just get those elements. The first 3D view, as its name indicates, will just convert the first 3D view. More often than not, that's not a very useful option. When you are converting a Revit project file, you need to make sure that you're working in a Navisworks view. So what I'll do now is I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of the options. I'm just going to go ahead and save this project, create a new file, and I'm going to toggle over to Revit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that, I have a standard 3D view in Revit. And what I want to do is I'm going to take this view and manipulate it to turn off a few elements, some of the RPC elements, the solar panels, the topography, and things like that. And while I can use visibility graphics, I'm just going to do something quick and dirty and just hide elements within this view. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is duplicate this view. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this as Navisworks. Right? The name is important. It needs to be Navisworks so that when I import it into Navisworks, it knows what to do with it. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just start citing some elements in my view, just by elements. Again, I could do this by category if I wanted to, but I find it easier right now just to pick these and hide those elements. And let's just get that last RPC element out of here. And suppose that this is my finished view. Again, I'm going to leave the furniture in here because I don't really want to spend too much time going through visibility graphics and selecting the right information. But all I need to do now is save this Revit project, and I'm going to go ahead and just drop it in this directory. And because I named the file the same, I'm going to go ahead and save it as something else. So bear with me while I go and I save this project on, let's call this example file. All right. So now that that Revit project is saved, I can go back into Navisworks and I can go ahead and choose open and directly choose that Revit file. You'll see here example file saved at 11:20 a.m. I'm going to go ahead and click open, and it's going to go ahead and optimize the geometry and the information within that file for import. All right. While that does that, I'm going to go ahead and point out that also inside of Revit, when you install Navisworks, it automatically installs Navisworks exporters, which you'll find in the add-ins tab under external tools. And you'll see there's Navisworks 2018 and Navisworks Switchback 2018. I'll talk a little bit about Switchback shortly. If I toggle back to Navisworks, you can see that it's optimizing that file. And if I were to pull up my Windows Explorer and just go to that directory, what you're going to see is that example file exists and that you're going to see that Navisworks automatically created that NWC file. Take a look at those file size differences, right? We're talking a very small Revit sample file of 17 megs being brought down to about 2 megs worth of information. You can imagine when you're working in a 200 meg or 300 meg Revit project, how that will scale down and make it a lot easier to parse through your information inside of Navisworks rather than inside of Revit with several linked models. So if I go back to Navisworks, you'll see that the elements that I selected are the only ones that came in. I didn't get the topo, I didn't get the RPCs, I didn't get those solar panels, etc. All right. Last but not least is, I just want to point out, since I am in Revit, and this really has to do later on with more of a clash detective workflow, something called Navisworks Switchback. What Navisworks Switchback allows me to do when toggled, right, I've just toggled it on, is to manipulate my Navisworks view, right? So let's suppose I want to look at these elements here from this perspective, and I need to see that same exact view inside of Revit. Well, the nice thing is I can select an element, and I will select just an object, and I can right-click and I can choose Switchback. And what's going to happen is Navisworks is well, it should be processing. Let's try that again. Right-click. You know what? I just realized I'm in Navisworks 2019, and I'm in Revit 2018. Needless to say, if I had the file open in Navisworks 2019 and I right-click and I choose Switchback, what Revit is going to do is it's going to create a view called Navisworks Switchback and orient the view exactly the same. If I have time at the end of the webinar, I'll go ahead and I'll give you a demonstration of that. All right. So that being said, I'm going to now jump into the viewpoints, sections, and review of the model. So in order for me to do that, I'm going to go ahead and open up the Navisworks file set I had created earlier by toggling just Navisworks file types and loading that introduction file. So now we get into the section where we can start manipulating our information. And I like to refer a Navisworks model as really just a database. It's a database with an interface, but it's a database nevertheless. And I typically say when I'm doing a training session on Navisworks, it's probably the easiest product to learn in the Autodesk umbrella. The reason I say that is because you're not authoring anything really, right? You're not creating elements, you're not creating the Revit project file. You don't need to have either the skills of an architect or an engineer to create elements. You're really just parsing the information that's already created for you. The downside to that is the information that you get, if it's garbage, you're going to have a hard time manipulating that well inside of Revit, inside of Navisworks. So let's talk a little bit about just selection and understanding and viewing our model inside of Navisworks. One thing I'd like to point out initially is that something that most people get hung up on is understanding the way that Navisworks selects elements. By default, Control-1 always allows me to bring up my selection arrow, right? You'll see that if I hover over that tooltip, I get my select Control-1, and I can either select via a pick or a selection box. And there are various ways to select elements within Revit based on a hierarchy, right? So if I select at the file level, right, and I choose any element within within my Navisworks model, I'm selecting the entire file. And this is reinforced by the fact that I can see that in my selection tree. And I can see that in my properties, right? So if I stretch this out, you can see it's selecting that NWC file. You can visually tell that it's selected on the screen, and you can tell it's visually selected on the canvas. As I drill down from file to layer, if I select the same element, you'll see instead of selecting the entire file, I'm selecting just that particular level inside of Revit, which is level 6. And as I drill down to first object, it starts drilling down further and further, right? There is something to be said about first, last, and last unique objects inside of Revit, and that has to do with the hierarchy of how these elements are created, right? Elements inside of Revit can be grouped. Elements inside of Revit can be made up of other sub-elements, right? You can have a family that's made up of nested families. And depending on the selection that you make, you'll drill down to that appropriate level. Always be aware of what your selection set is. And then last but not least, you pick geometry, and that goes straight to the last element within that object, which is this metal panel wall pattern for that particular object, right? And again, if I choose one of the solar panels, you'll see that it jumps directly to that element, and then clicking anywhere else on the screen exits the selection and brings me back. So it's very important to make sure that you have your selection set to what you want, because ultimately, not only are you going to be selecting the element that you want using those selection methods or resolutions, the information that's displayed in the properties is directly corresponds to what it is you're choosing. So if I choose something at the geometry level, I'm only going to see information about the geometry. If I choose information at the object level, I'm going to actually be seeing information about the object itself, right? Element IDs and mechanical properties and whatever information is inside my built-in information model. There are a couple of ways to manipulate your views inside of Navisworks as well. And what I'll do is I'll unpin that selection tree and talk a little bit about visibility. At any point, you can use the Control H toggle or the hide up at the top to hide an element within Navisworks. So if I want to turn off all architectural elements so I can see the structural model and the mechanical model, I can just simply select that file and press Control H. Pressing Control H again retoggles that back on. Alternatively, if I've hidden a few things, haphazardly, and I want to make sure I see everything, I can just choose the unhide all. Right? It's basically showing show all. Right? It's a bit weird name, but you get what it means after you use the tool for a while. Alternatively, if I've selected something and I want to hide what's not selected, I can use the hide unselected. So you can see in this case, hide unselected when I have the architectural model selected hides the mechanical and structural. You can see they're hidden because of their grayed out status. Next, I want to talk a little bit about just navigating through your view. Now, of course, I'm not going to spend too much time educating you on, the various ways of manipulating your view, panning, orbiting, that sort of thing. It's pretty typical from your standard ways of orbiting and panning inside of Revit and AutoCAD. Slightly different than other products like 3ds Max and Rhino, but effectively middle button shift pans and holding down shift, the middle button orbits. You do have a great set of tools for manipulating your model in terms of views. The navigation wheel is quite handy as it follows my mouse around and allows me to zoom in or look up and down or rewind my view so that I can go back to where I started. And I can always press Shift W to exit out of that. One very useful tool is the footsteps, which stands for walk. And it allows me to go ahead and navigate my model as if I were walking through this project. So I'm going to go ahead and just blast through some walls that don't have collision detection enabled just to get you inside. And you can see here that the walk tool allows me to simulate what it would be like to walk through a Navisworks project. In addition, I can enable a couple of things to add a certain amount of realism, right? Like collision, gravity, and third person. What this allows me to do is to walk through my model as a person might, right? I can certainly walk up the stairs and you'll see me as I can navigate up and it'll hop, 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 hop all the way up. And you can control your visibility of all these settings through your viewpoint options, right? So I'll just point out that you can edit any of the current viewpoint settings from your degree of view to your collision settings directly inside the Navisworks project. All right. Again, because of the wide variety of things I want to show, I'm not going to spend too much time in here, but just know that you can manipulate your project in this fashion. Simply Unselecting those other settings will allow me to go back to my standard view. And at any point, if I have a viewpoint that I'd like to save to revisit, I can go ahead and do so by just going to my viewpoint and clicking the camera icon. What that'll allow me to do is create a new viewpoint. I'll call this atrium view. And the nice thing is if I manipulate my tools to walk out of that and I want to go back to that view, I just simply select that view and I'm back, or I should say that viewpoint. So viewpoints will store any of the views that were created inside of the Revit project, as well as any of the ones that you're going to want to create for yourselves to set some viewpoints so that you can go and show the project off to either a coordination team or a client to show the elements that you want within a model. I'll also point out that there is a couple of different view styles, right, or rendering styles. So you can see that my mode is set to full render, which allows me to see this brick pattern. I can also further make the view look a little bit nicer. If you have a pretty decent graphics card, you can enable things like ambient occlusion and increase your image library from base to a high resolution to give you the best overall appearance for these elements. And you can see here that I get a slightly better overview of lighting and materials by doing so at the cost of my model being slightly slower to redraw and navigate through. So for the sake of this webinar, I'm going to go ahead and disable those just because they make walking through the model a little bit slower. And I'm going to change my mode from full render to shaded. I typically recommend going to a shaded mode directly if you're going to just be manipulating and understanding your model, as it makes the display of these elements way quicker than if you were using the rendered view. Again, lighting, you can use full lights if you have lights for sunlight and lights within your model, but the headlight basically attaches the headlight to your virtual self inside of Navisworks. So as I'm navigating through, I'm always casting light in the direction that I'm looking, making it easier for me to see elements within the model. All right. And then last but not least, I'm going to go ahead and just pan all the way out and actually press Control Home to just take a look at my model from the outside perspective. And what I'm going to do now is enable sectioning. And what enabling sectioning allows me to do is add some section planes, right? So I'm going to go ahead and create some planes here. And I'm going to enable my top plane. And I'm going to go ahead and click to move it. And I'm going to navigate the gizmo. And what you're going to see here, let me just orient myself a little bit better so that my gizmo is centered around the object. And there we go. So what section planes allow me to do is to drag and drop different section planes through the model so that you can see what your model looks like at that particular elevation, right? So as I scroll down and move my gizmo to a point I can see my audience view, there's a little bit of delay. I moved it about a few seconds ago, so I'll let it catch up. You can see here that I can cut a section directly through the Navisworks project. I can enable multiple views. So for example, if I wanted to crop both the back and the front of the model, I can do so, right? And I should enable there we go, my back. And you can see as I'm cutting through, I can now see a nice clear cut section of the Navisworks project. In addition to planes, I can also enable a box, right? That allows me to create a section based on a section box, similar to what you'd have inside of Revit, that enables me to see the project within that cut plane. I can also choose to scale it up on a Z direction to include more, an X and Y direction to create better views depending on what it is that I'm analyzing. But again, all this is about manipulating your view so you have a better and clearer understanding of what's inside your project. Once I'm done, I can just simply choose to disable sectioning, and I have my view as I need it to be. All right. Now we'll talk a little bit about review. And review is pretty straightforward. There is a series of tools for redlining elements within your Navisworks project. And so what I'll do here is I'm just going to zoom into a certain section just to show you some of the tools. Most of the tools revolve around two certain types of workflows. Either you're doing some measurements, or you're doing some redlining, or you're doing some combination thereof. So what I'll do is I'm going to just enable ambient occlusion just for a second to make it easier for me to see where these edges are located. And I'm just going to show you a handful of measure tools, right? You have the point-to-point, which will allow me to go ahead and draw a a measured item that'll give me a display of what that element is. I can do point to point. I can do point to multiple points. So if I wanted to see, okay, is that point from there to there the same as there to there? I can go ahead and do so. And you can see the snap icons show up as I hover over a face or a vertex or a plane. I can do a point line. So if I wanted to understand what a series of points represent in terms of a linear length, I can do so. I can do an accumulate. So if I needed to understand maybe from this corner from here to there and from that corner from there to there, right? It's going to accumulate as I keep clicking. You're seeing going to go from 25 to now 38 and change. And I'm not snapping exactly to the vertices, so you're getting some odd numbers, but you understand the idea. And then last but not least, I can do an angle. So if I wanted to make sure that something was exactly 90 degrees or something along those lines, I can go ahead and measure. Didn't do a great job of grabbing that vertex there, but you can see it gives me the value for that geometry. And then last but not least, I'll do area if I want to just manipulate a quick area here. I didn't do a great job of selecting the vertices, but you'll see that I can get a square footage pretty quickly in terms of what that information represents. At any point, I can convert these to a red line by just clicking this icon, and you're going to see that it creates an automatic viewpoint. And I can call this red line edit for, annotation. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to jump back to that particular view at any point. Because redlining is focused on just a specific viewpoint, the minute I navigate away, it disappears. But when I go back to a red line, you can see that it's there. I can also put in some text, right? Put in some text. This is some text. I can manipulate where I placed it by just moving it to some other location. I can draw a revision cloud if I so choose. Note to the audience, right? If you want to draw a good revision cloud, you always have to go clockwise. Otherwise, your revision cloud will be inverted. All right. That's about it that I want to talk about for redlining at this point. I do want to jump into the appearance profiler. And in order for me to do so, I'm going to go ahead and just have to talk a little bit about some other elements within Navisworks. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and just choose a view that shows my entire mechanical model. I'm going to exit out of my redlining tools. And I'm going to talk a little bit about find, which is probably the most critical aspects of learning Navisworks. And the reason I say this is because find ultimately allows you to create things that are known as sets, which allow you to do clash detection and easy quantification of your Navisworks project. Now, in general, the find elements are focused around really building a query, right? It's a logical query that stipulates a certain set of conditions. And as an example, I'm going to go ahead and just choose an element here to learn more about its properties, right? So if I choose this and I can see that that represents round duct, and I wanted to find all round ducts because I want to color them in a certain way, I can do so by building a query. So in order to build a query, you need to understand a little bit about how Navisworks perceives these elements, and the easiest way to do so is to select an element and look at its properties. So the way I'm going to build my query is directly related to how I'm viewing the information inside my properties. So if I want to select all round ducts, I select a sample round duct. I look at its properties. I can see my category is called item. My property is going to be called type. I'm going to apply a condition like contains, for example, and then I'm going to choose the word round. So as an example, if I choose item and I choose type and I choose contains and I can type in the word round, I can do a search for all round elements inside of the model, right? It won't select any rectangular elements in there, but you can see that I can build a very specific query that allows me to do so. If I had said that maybe this included the word duct and I do a find all, well, then it's going to include everything. But I can also then build maybe another second condition. Suppose I want to grab all duct, but at this time I decide, okay, now I only want to grab something that contains the word round. So I can build the same query, right? It's a, first selection is grabbing, it's grabbing duct. Navisworks is particularly finicky about where you click. And now I can choose round. And what it's doing is it's building a logical sequence where it uses an AND condition, right? By default, it's an AND condition. If I want to, I can specify an OR condition, and I won't go into any discussions about logic diagrams. But what I am pulling up on the right-hand side of my monitor is if you want to understand a little bit about AND, OR, and NOT, you know, look up logic tables and understand a little bit more about that. It helps you really build a understanding of how to build these queries. But by doing an AND condition, I'm looking for item types that contain duct and item types that contain round. And when I do a find all, it's doing the same thing as before. All right. A quick word about these checkboxes here. The ones I get most information questions about is what does character width and diacritics mean? These have to do with foreign languages, double width characters and diacritics, which appear like accented letters, like an accent over the letter E in French and Spanish and Portuguese, right? If you want to match those in your selection, if you're working in a foreign place, then you would try to match those. For all intents and purposes, leaving these all unchecked will give you the best results because you don't care about case, you don't care about diacritics or any special characters that may exist. All right. Once I've built those queries, I can very easily assign sets to the to my project. And a set is basically a collection of elements. Now, a collection can include a definitive set of elements, right? You can see here that by running this query, I grabbed 5,851 items. If I create what's known as a selection set, it's only going to select those 5,851 elements. What's the difference between that and a search set? Well, the search set allows me to run that query all over again and select those elements dynamically. Why is that important? Well, as a project develops, you're going to be changing information within the project. So the number of ducts you may have changed, the number of doors and windows you may have changed. Any element within your Revit project is subject to change and subject to changing the number of those elements within a model. So if you choose to just do a selection set, you may be missing information because you're running a query that's old. So by saving a selection set, you're going to be able to query information that's active and dynamic. So I can just call this round ducts, for example. And then I no longer have to ever run that query again. I can just choose to select it here in this element, right? The nice thing is that you can then choose, because everything here is showing up as white, you can then choose to run what's known as an appearance profiler on the sets that you load. Now, the nice thing is I can build a set of appearances profiles based on my protocol, right? If I'm running the coordination meeting and I always want electric to be red and fire protection to be maroon and IT to be yellow and plumbing to be blue and so on and so forth, I can run those settings. Now, in general, I'm going to run this and nothing's going to happen because none of the criteria here meet my standards. But let's just say I have a set called mechanical, right? I'm just going to say everything under the HVAC is going to be a selection set, and I'm going to call this mechanical. And it helps if I name that correctly. Mechanical, right? When I refresh my sets and I ensure that that mechanical set is in there and I click run, it's going to run and make all my mechanical systems green, right? And this is true of any other elements within my Navisworks set. So why is this great? I'll reemphasize the purpose of this is as you're working inside of Navisworks and you're manipulating the geometry on several different projects, you don't want to have to do this every single time. Incidentally, it's also something along the lines of you can save all these sets and export them out to an XML file, right? So if you build queries within Navisworks that you want to reutilize on every project that you work on, you can do so. Right? And I'll go ahead and I'll talk a little bit about this at the end of the session, you know, just because I want to make sure I cover all the bases. Now that we've gone through that, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about probably the most important aspect of Navisworks, which is the clash detective. In order for me to do so, I'm going to go ahead and reset my workspace to extended. I'm going to unhide all elements within the Revit project. I'm going to hide the architectural model. And what I'm going to do is just leave the structural and mechanical. One thing I didn't point out earlier is occasionally you'll have line work that shows up inside your model. You can see those analytical representations of the footing. There's a way to turn off all line work so you only see 3D solids inside of your viewpoint, and I just did that right there for you. So now I'm going to give you one example of running a clash detection inside of Navisworks. In order for me to do so, I'm going to go ahead and pin the clash detective to the screen, and I'm going to unpin the rest because I want to make sure I have plenty of room to show what I'm about to show you. And what I'm about to show you is the following. I'm going to add a test, and a test is a simple way of Navisworks to delineate a clash test, right? And I'm going to call this HVAC versus structural steel. Now I'm going to combine some of the things we saw earlier, right? If I simply select HVAC and structural, I'm going to get the entire file. So how would I go ahead and just find steel elements within my structural model? Well, I'm going to go ahead and use find. And I can do that by just choosing my structural model, deleting all conditions, choosing a structural element within the element, and I want to bring up my window for properties so I can see that because I closed that up. Oh, there it is. So you can see here that by selecting that element, I can see that it's a structural column. It may have the material steel, right? So if I can go ahead and just say select an item with a material that contains the word steel and do a find all, I'm selecting all the columns, all the framing, and in this case, I got some of the piles for the foundations as well. That's good enough for what I want to do right now. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is save this set as a search set, and I'm going to call this structural steel. And you're seeing now I'm combining some of the things I've been working on. And instead of choosing the structural element within the clash detection, I'm going to go ahead and choose a set. And because I ran that set, I can now clash the entire model of the HVAC mechanical to just the search for steel. There are several icons here that I'll quickly talk a little bit about, right? You can clash surfaces, which is what we want to do. Lines and points, again, those have limited uses. Point clouds would be an example of where you'd use points. You can also choose whether or not to test self-intersecting elements. And then there's 4 types of clashes. This is probably the most salient point of this discussion, which is what are you clashing? Hard and hard conservative, what's the difference? Well, it's a very subtle and nuanced difference, but a hard clash physically means 2 elements interfering with each other within a certain tolerance, right? So if I have a mechanical duct clashing with a structural element, meaning it's intersecting that geometry within my tolerance, it'll show up as a clash. The difference between hard and hard conservative has to do with the way that Navisworks optimizes geometry. So if you have a round duct, Navisworks isn't really creating a round duct, it's creating a tessellated version of that made up of several vertices. What the hard conservative allows Navisworks to do is instead of clashing those triangulated round shape, it's actually going to clash the actual shape. And so you will get better results in very tight conditions. Again, that depends on how conservative you want to be with your clash. Clearance allows me to add a clearance so that if an element isn't physically touching, but it's within a certain clearance zone, it shows up as a clash. You can use that as a way to do insulation clash detection. And of course, duplicates. If you have 2 models and you want to understand where you have duplicates, you can run that. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to go ahead and just use a hard clash, and I'm going to run that test, and you're going to see that I get 419 results. The biggest thing to note about Navisworks, and the biggest amount of time you're going to invest in understanding what your clashes are, is understanding how different, I guess I should say, differentiating between what are true clashes and what are false positives, right? There are going to always be clashes depending on how a project is modeled. Clashing mechanical systems with slabs, if the designer didn't put in openings within your Revit structural slab model, those are going to be showing up as clashes. They may not be, but it's just something that you need to note, right? It could be that later on in the design development, you're going to create openings, and so you can choose to ignore those. In any event, the clash detection, the clash detective shows all the various clashes within a model. You can sort by proximity, meaning that clashes that are closer together will show up. You can see here that at any point, I can see the 2 clashing elements, right? And if I choose to view my items, I can see what elements are clashing, right? I can see that mechanical system, this round duct is clashing with this structural member. At any point, I can also take a look at some of the metadata associated with the clash. I can see the level and grid information, right? That allows me to more easily pinpoint information within where that clash is located. And you can see the type of clash. I can assign it to an individual or a company during a coordination meeting. And I can choose to change the status based on either something that is built into Navisworks or by letting Navisworks rerun through several clashes. So as an example of that, I'm going to go ahead and find a clash that allows me to quickly resolve it. The way you'd really resolve this in the real world is to resolve the clash by making sure that you're manipulating the actual authored geometry. So if I go ahead and I find just something simple like this clash here, you're going to see that I can select this round duct. Yep, I can select that round duct, and I'm going to just use some of the manipulation tools within Navisworks to move it, right? It's no longer clashing. By the way, this is not the way you would manipulate your geometry. I'm doing this as an example to show you what happens when I rerun that clash, right? So when I rerun that clash, you're going to see that instead of 419 clashes that are active, I now have 418 with one resolved, right? Rerunning a clash changes the status from a clash from new to active, meaning it's still ongoing. And of course, if I scroll all the way down, any clashes that are resolved by you manipulating the geometry in the authored model, republishing the NWC and sharing that NWC with whoever is controlling the coordination meeting, you'll see that you get a quick resolve to that clash. I can certainly resolve clashes on the fly by doing so. And if I approve it, it notes who approved that clash, right? So if I'm going in there and saying, hey, that's okay, it's going to note that I've said that that's okay, so that from a paper trail perspective, if something comes up as an RFI and you can trace it back to me approving it, then the liability, the responsibility is on me because I said that that was an approved clash. Ultimately, you're going to want to create a report, and I'm going to go ahead and just click on the report tab and write a quick HTML report to my desktop, just to give you an example of what that looks like. I'm going to create a quick HTML report folder, select that, run save, and now I'm going to generate that report. Once that's done, I'll get a simple HTML report that shows me the information I selected. You can see here all the various checkboxes. It's going to give me a thumbnail of that clash with the clash view, and that thumbnail can be clicked and opened up in a new tab as a larger image, so you have a more clear view of what that clash is. And so I'll let that build out real quick, and I'm just going to move on to the last two elements. I may have to skip animator presenter just for the sake of time. I'll continue, but I realize 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock is coming up on the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and just talk a little bit about Timeliner and quantification. And so Timeliner, well, as soon as this is built, I'll jump into the Navisworks project that allows me to show you Timeliner. And effectively, Timeliner is a way for me to map a construction schedule to a series of elements within Navisworks. So I'm going to go ahead and reset my workspace, and I'm going to go ahead and just show you my Timeliner tab down here at the bottom. And I'm going to just point out the following, right? I have a series of Navisworks elements inside of here made up from several different sources. I have my Timeliner Gantt chart, which allows me to map certain tasks to a planned start and end date, which creates a Gantt chart that I can view here on the right-hand side. I can bring in several data sources. If I go ahead and now choose add, you'll see that I can bring in something as basic as a CSV file, right? So I can create a CSV file that specifies a task name, has a planned start and end date, and directly import that in. If you're using Microsoft Project or Primavera, you can bring in those files as well. What I will point out is that for Primavera, you do need an active version of Primavera, a licensed copy on your machine for that to work. With Microsoft Project, I can simply just import in an MPX file. What was done for this example was the importing of an MPP file, Microsoft Project file, which created all these various tasks and had planned start and end dates. The most difficult aspect of Timeliner isn't the fact that you're using the tool. It's the way that you want to manipulate the geometry that you're given or you have with a more pertinent task association. You're going to see the one I'm going to show you, as I'm going to simulate through it, has all these explicit selections, which means that somebody went in here and for every one of these tasks selected a series of elements within Navisworks to be built for that appropriate task. Why is this an issue? Well, certainly when you receive information from a consultant or you're running the the timeline yourself on a project that you developed, you're not building a Revit project file in the way that a real-world project is constructed. What's the simplest example of that? Well, floor slabs. So suppose for a large project, you're pouring an enormous floor slab, and that's going to be broken down into several tasks as the pours happen on various days. Well, a Revit slab isn't modeled like that. You model the entire floor slab for that level, and that's what you have. If you wanted to break out that floor slab into separate pours, you're going to need to reconstruct that Revit project and break out that slab into separate objects so that you can then assign those to individual tasks. What do I mean by that? Let's take a look at this example, which really shows you the power of Simulate. And because I know this won't play very well over being streamed on the GoToWebinar, I'm going to just scrub through the video. And you can see as I do so in my pause, various elements within the timeline are being built, right? So it's taking a little bit of a lag, but I can go ahead and just scrub to the video, and it's going to be building individual elements that are tied to those tasks, right? New elements are shown up in green, and finished elements are shown in their finished view properties. And because of the lag, you can see the audience view lags quite behind what I'm actually showing you. I don't want to hit the play button, but if you take a look at where my mouse is, if I played through that, you'd get a quick sense of the entire Navisworks project being built up in one shot. All right. So again, the critical thing to realize is that the major hurdle is assigning a specific task to a specific set of elements. And to give you an example of that, if I were to look at the footings, right, you can see the foundations here have an explicit selection. And if I choose that selection and I look at what's being selected, somebody went and selected those elements. If I go and I look at maybe steel beams, I just saw them, or shallow foundations, and let me go to some of the other elements. Right, if I choose these, you're going to see that different elements are selected depending on what it is that I'm choosing inside of the model. All right, and then last but not least, I'll talk a little bit about the quantification tools, because I think that's probably the next most important aspect of Navisworks. And what I'll say to that is it's quite easy to go back to our file set that we created earlier. And I'll go up one folder and open up that and say there's two approaches, right? One approach is to use the CSI quantification organization methodology. The other is to do a simple quantity takeoff on the entire model and push it out to Excel for further manipulation. What do I mean by that? Well, let me go ahead and I'll show you. Right, if I bring up my quantification workbook and I run through a project setup, you're going to see that I'm going to step through a handful of elements. The first is that I'm going to choose a format. I can choose none or some of the pre-built CSI formats or unit formats. I'm going to choose CSI 16, which will just give me the 16 categories associated with that. If I have my own catalog that I've pre-built, I can use that as well. I'm going to go ahead and choose my units, which is imperial. And I'm just going to go ahead and map the default settings, which map what units I am to the properties, right? So length is feet, width is feet, thickness is feet. It could be inches if I wanted, and so on and so forth. Once that's done, it's going to build my quantity workbook based on the CSI categories, right? So you see general requirements, site construction, concrete. And if you're not familiar with CSI, right, if I do a quick CSI catalog format, right, I should get the wiki article. My goodness, I cannot type for the life of me. All right, let's try that one more time, or 3 more times. There we go. My goodness. I know it's the top of the hour where I can't even type a couple of letters, right? So you can see here that the CSI has several different formats. There's 16 divisions, which is the 16 divisions that you're seeing here: general requirements, masonry, furnishings. They correspond to those elements here. You can build out a series of items based on those same elements. So for example, if I look at my quantification workbook and I go to my item catalog, I can, for example, use some of the information that I alluded to earlier. So I'm going to do a quick find, and I'm going to go ahead and just find any item that has type, that has a condition that contains door. And if I do that, I'm going to go ahead and find 960 elements. I'm going to hide everything except those doors, right? And you can see that I can just find doors here. And if I choose one door type, I can see that that door is a single flush door. So what I can do inside of this to organize my information a little bit better is maybe go to doors and finishes, create a new group, call that single flush doors, create a new item. I'm going to name that item the same thing that it's named in here by right-clicking, choosing copy value, and then I can go ahead and rename this to include single flush doors that are 3 feet wide and 6 and 8 inches high. I can then choose to go back to my quantification workbook and take a look at that same CSI format. I can right-click and choose select same type from inside my Navisworks model. And using that selection, I can right-click and I can take off the selected elements. Taking off those selected elements does the following. It shows me that, allows me to, let me just undo that. It allows me to quantify the elements that are in here, and I'm going to just switch my view from full render to shaded, because what I want to show you is a few things, right? First, every single door that matches the criteria that I quantified is listed here on the right, right? You can see all the 190 doors were counted. In addition, it's assigned them to a color, right? So inside my item catalog, let me make this red so it's easier to see. Right? If I make these red, you can see very quickly what elements have been taken off because it applies a filter to it. In addition, I can just turn off things that I've already taken off so that I don't take, I'm not confused about whether or not I've taken them already off. And I can move on to my next quantification, right? The one button push of how to do this is the following. I can go to hide, unhide all, hide this information, choose my entire file for the architectural model and run what's known as a model takeoff, right? And what it's going to do is it's going to build a brand new category just called what the name of the file is and create an entire set of quantifications based on the element type names. What that allows me to do is then export that out to an Excel spreadsheet, which I'm just going to jump to and not create because it takes a while to generate. And I'll just show you what that might look like, right? So if I look in here, I should have a quantity report. And you can see here that it generates a pivot table using just Excel breakdown of information that you want to see, right? This allows me to style and run as much estimation as I want based off that quantity takeoff. Because this comes with a table, right? That's called group table. If you know Excel and you're like a little bit of an Excel nerd like me and you love creating pivot tables, the easiest thing in the world is to create a new pivot table based on the information you just want. So if I create a pivot table and I want to go ahead and start adding groups here, right? Group 1 brings in my file, group 2 brings in the level, group 3 brings in the element. Well, maybe I want to filter out by elements and say that I only want to see doors, right? And so if I do that, then when I go to my pivot table and I finally add group 4, which is the element, it's only going to show me those doors. But I'll tell you what, I don't want to see a category name. I actually want to see all the values, right? And so I can do group 4 as a summary and I can do group 4 as a count. And you can see here very easily I was able to generate a series of pivot table that just tells me what doors, what types, how many are there on a level basis. If I didn't care about level basis, well, I could easily remove group 2 from the mix and I could just see for my entire model how many doors of a particular type I have based on a particular type of door. Now, at the item level, you can go one step further, right, and add different types of doors and so on and so forth. So it's a very easy way to get the information that you need in a format that gives you that ability.